Revenue gaps rarely begin at the moment they become obvious. By the time the business feels the pressure, the weakness usually started earlier. That is what makes revenue gaps so easy to misread. They often look sudden. A month feels softer than expected. Deals did not close in time. The forecast now looks too thin. Urgency appears all at once. So the business experiences the gap as if it arrived late. But in many cases, the gap did not start late. It started upstream, inside the pipeline, when coverage weakened, when momentum softened, when confidence stayed too high, or when too few strong opportunities were forming early enough. That is the real problem. A revenue gap is rarely just a final stage event. It is often the visible consequence of earlier weakness that was not interpreted clearly enough when there was still time to respond. This matters because timing changes everything. If the business notices the weakness early, it can still react with discipline. It can strengthen acquisition. It can reevaluate confidence. It can clean weak assumptions out of the pipeline. It can improve attention allocation while options still exist. But if the weakness is noticed late, reaction becomes much harder. Now pressure rises, urgency increases, and the business tries to compensate with less time, less room, and worse decision quality. This is why revenue gaps should never be treated as isolated surprises. They are usually pipeline signals that were visible earlier, but not read with enough seriousness to change behavior in time. That is the real difference between reacting to a revenue gap and preventing one. Prevention begins when the business learns to notice that revenue problems often start before revenue itself shows the damage clearly.
What makes this difficult is that pipeline weakness does not always look dramatic when it begins. At first, it may look small. A few opportunities slow down. Confidence starts depending on older assumptions. Coverage becomes thinner than it should be. Some cases remain open without enough real strength to justify the weight they still carry. None of that always creates alarm immediately. The pipeline still looks active. There are still names inside it. Some movement still exists. So the business delays concern. That is where the real risk grows, because revenue gaps expand quietly before they become visible loudly. The business keeps operating as if enough value is still forming, when in reality, the underlying support for future revenue is already getting weaker. This is why waiting for the gap to become obvious is too late. Once the shortfall is visible at the revenue level, the earlier pipeline conditions that caused it have often been weakening for longer than anyone wanted to admit. That delay matters because response time matters. A business with early awareness still has room to improve coverage, shift attention, or change priority. A business with late awareness usually has only pressure. That is the real cost of missing the signal early. Not only the gap itself, but the loss of time to respond well before the gap hardens.
This is why revenue gaps should be read as timing failures, not only outcome failures. The revenue number is usually the last place where weakness becomes undeniable. Before that, the signals are already there. Coverage is thinner. Priority is drifting. Older opportunities are still carrying more confidence than they should. Newer opportunities are not strong enough yet to replace what is weakening upstream. That is how the gap starts. Not at closing, but before closing. Not when revenue is already missing, but when the pipeline no longer contains enough healthy movement to support what the business expects later. This is what many teams miss. They keep asking, why did the revenue fall short? When the stronger question is, when did the pipeline stop supporting it well enough? That change in perspective matters because it moves attention from reaction to interpretation. A business that reads revenue gaps early does not wait for the miss to become official. It notices that the conditions required to sustain future revenue are already becoming weaker now. That makes better action possible. Not panic, not last-minute pressure, earlier correction. That is the real value of pipeline discipline. It helps the business see that revenue gaps usually begin when future support becomes too soft, too thin, or too delayed to carry the target safely.
And once that is visible, the business is no longer surprised by the gap at the end. It has already seen where the gap was beginning to form.
A stronger system does not wait for revenue pressure to create urgency. It allows urgency to rise earlier when the pipeline is still changing and the business still has time to respond with control. That is what makes early signal recognition so valuable. If coverage is weakening, that matters now. If confidence is staying too high in opportunities that are softening, that matters now. If too much of the pipeline is still open without enough real movement, that matters now. These are not small details. They are early warnings that the revenue picture ahead may already be getting weaker. A healthy business should not need the final miss to take those warnings seriously. It should be able to see that future revenue support is already becoming less reliable before the outcome becomes painful. That changes the quality of decision-making. Acquisition can be strengthened earlier, priority can be cleaned up earlier, false confidence can be reduced earlier, and the team can respond while there is still enough time to improve the pipeline without falling into reactive pressure. This is why revenue gaps should never be read only from the bottom line. The bottom line confirms the problem. The pipeline starts it. And once the business learns to read that upstream weakness with enough honesty, revenue gaps stop feeling sudden. They start becoming visible while there is still time to do something smarter about them. A stronger system does not wait for revenue pressure to create urgency. It allows urgency to rise earlier when the pipeline is still changing and the business still has time to respond with control. That is what makes early signal recognition so valuable. If coverage is weakening, that matters now. If confidence is staying too high in opportunities that are softening, that matters now. If too much of the pipeline is still open without enough real movement, that matters now. These are not small details. They are early warnings that the revenue picture ahead may already be getting weaker. A healthy business should not need the final miss to take those warnings seriously. It should be able to see that future revenue support is already becoming less reliable before the outcome becomes painful. That changes the quality of decision-making. Acquisition can be strengthened earlier, priority can be cleaned up earlier, false confidence can be reduced earlier, and the team can respond while there is still enough time to improve the pipeline without falling into reactive pressure. This is why revenue gaps should never be read only from the bottom line. The bottom line confirms the problem. The pipeline starts it. And once the business learns to read that upstream weakness with enough honesty, revenue gaps stop feeling sudden. They start becoming visible while there is still time to do something smarter about them.
This is also why late reactions usually feel heavier than they should. By the time the business fully accepts the revenue risk, the pipeline often has less flexibility left. There is less time for new opportunities to mature. There is less room for weaker assumptions to be corrected gradually. There is less ability to recover calmly from old confidence that stayed in the system too long. Now the business is not responding from strength. It is responding from compression. That creates bad pressure. Urgency rises, but clarity often drops. Teams push harder. Acquisition becomes more reactive. Forecast interpretation becomes more emotional. And the business starts trying to solve in a short window what had actually been forming for much longer. That is why early recognition matters so much. It protects timing. A business that sees the gap forming early still has room to improve the pipeline with discipline. A business that sees it late usually has to compensate with speed it can no longer support well. This is why revenue gaps should be treated as delayed consequences of earlier pipeline weakness, not only final misses. Because once the business learns to read those earlier signals honestly, it becomes much better at preventing pressure instead of only reacting to it.
When a business learns to read revenue gaps early, the pipeline stops being only a record of opportunity activity. It becomes an early warning system. That is the real shift.
The business is no longer waiting for missed revenue to confirm that something is wrong. It is watching for thinner coverage, weaker confidence, slower movement, and softer support before the shortfall becomes final. That changes behavior immediately. Attention gets sharper, urgency becomes more disciplined, and planning becomes less dependent on late-stage surprises. This is what makes pipeline clarity so valuable. Not that it removes uncertainty, but that it reveals weakening conditions while there is still time to respond with better judgment. A revenue gap should not feel sudden. If the business is reading the pipeline well, the early signs should already be visible. And once those signs are taken seriously, the business becomes much better at protecting future revenue before the pressure reaches the bottom line.
That is why strong businesses do not wait for revenue gaps to become undeniable. They try to see them while they are still forming. Not at the end, but earlier. When coverage is getting thinner, when confidence is too old, when movement is not strong enough to support what the business still expects. That is the real discipline. Because once the warning is visible early, the business can still respond with proportion, not panic. It can improve the pipeline before pressure hardens. And that is what makes the difference. A revenue gap does not become dangerous only when the number falls short. It becomes dangerous when the business fails to notice that the support for future revenue was already weakening before that moment arrived.